Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Shackman. If there ever was a need for proof that politics and entertainment were now conflated, this election cycle proves it conclusively. And while on the surface it seems that this trivializes our politics, makes fun of serious issues, and gives the advantage to those more experienced at entertainment than policy, it also opens up powerful and unique opportunities to use entertainment in the form of street theater, theatrical protest, and political performance as a means to move the needle on a whole range of important issues. Our guest today on Radio Who, What, Why is one of our nation's experts on understanding and using theatrical protest. L.M. Bogad is an author, performer, and the founding director of the Center for Tactical Performance. He's a professor of political performance at UC Davis and a co-founder of the clandestine insurgent rebel clown army. His previous book is Electoral Guerrilla Theater, and his newest work is Tactical Performance, the Theory and Practice of Serious Play. It is my pleasure to welcome L.M. Bogad to Radio Who, What, Why.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
As our politics in real life has become more theatrical, has become almost a kind of theater unto itself, has that lessened the power of political protest, of political theater?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, we have so many, it's getting more and more almost exaggerated in tone as the years go on. And I have had several friends, of course, saying to me, Trump's faking it, right? He's fake. That's a performance, right? It's both a performance and he's not faking it in the sense that there's things that are really at stake with these performances, right? He is a persona, right? So in that context of this overwhelming kind of barrage of images and information we get every day, and sort of the overwhelming tone that gets more and more raw and more outrageous, I still think that the challenge, there's just a new challenge for us, which is that protests have to get more creative, more visually stimulating, more surprising and playful, perhaps. So I do think that older forms of political protest maybe, while very well-intentioned, may have less impact because they kind of get swallowed up by this entertainment culture that we have. So I think there's a need to do that very serious organizing for protest and think theatrically and think in terms of sociodrama. I don't think protest is irrelevant. I think there's just new challenges, and I think that sort of creativity is at a premium.
And as that creativity has to be pushed out, as the envelope has to be expanded to the extremes, does that run the risk of, while it may make it more attention-grabbing, does it run the risk of trivializing it in some way?
Well, here's the thing, and that's great too. I've worked with groups as a writer or performer or just an advisor, and also researched groups that focused on being funny. And I think that can be great, and it's not necessarily trivializing. It can go that way. So groups like Billionaires for Bush, which the website's still up there, basically play as sort of cartoon oligarchs and followed Bush or Karl Rove around and made these media spectacles that were very silly, but made the point about the class inequality. So that kind of action may seem like it's trivializing, but if it's done with the right balance, I actually think that satire can show that you're taking an issue seriously enough to make fun of it. That may seem contradictory, but there's almost, we have a great tradition in this country of that. And I think that satire is the sort of unstable cocktail of idealism and cynicism. So it's not only cynical. But having said that, actions like Billionaires for Bush and other things like the Oil Enforcement Agency, which took Bush at his word and said, okay, if you really think we should get off of oil, as he said in one of his State of the Union speeches, we're going to pretend you meant that, and we're going to create this enforcement agency and go and raid auto shows and places like that to try to pretend these are your policies. But there's also the other side of tactical performance. It's not all satirical, right? Sometimes it's just about being very creative, but in a very somber way. So just one quick example that I think certainly is not trivializing. was the group 1,000 Coffins. And this is a recent example from the Bush administration, where the Bush administration had said, okay, you can't take pictures of the flag-covered coffins coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. And they knew that was a powerful image, and I understand why they would want to sort of ban the photography of those coffins. But before that, what this group did, and again, not funny, not satirical, but a group called 1,000 Coffins said, all right, let's create those coffins. Let's create that image. And they made 1,000 coffins, covered them with flags, and marched them through the streets of New York and D.C., and it was this gripping, very somber image. They worked with progressive veterans groups who wanted to work with them to create this. And essentially, they were performing the censored image.
If we look for the various golden ages of political satire historically, what do we see in terms of the forces that came together to really generate and encourage that? Because it does seem that in our current environment, because views are so extreme, because reality seems to be so different for each side, that somehow satire is not as powerful as it has been in previous times.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think sometimes when there's more repression and satire has to work harder in an almost clandestine way, it's harder to do and it's more dangerous, but it does create, there's a higher bar for work that's going to get out there. So when you have to actually work harder at your craft to get it out there, I think that's maybe one of the elements, is that if there's more pressure on your work to be more playful, more clever, to be coded, that's one element. In our time now, we still have these wonderful opportunities, though. So I would add that it's not so. There's plenty of people to reach and communicate with in our current body politic. And I think surprise is a key element here, Jeff. I think that the element of surprise, I don't mean shocking people, because I don't think you can shock people so easily anymore in this culture, It's such an extreme culture in that sense. I think if you're playful and surprising in your actions, I think there's a lot of people in the middle and a lot of people who've dropped out who you can engage with on an issue, be it climate change, be it the minimum wage, be it homelessness or human rights. If you do an action that does somebody the favor of, in a good way, surprising them, they're walking down the street, they're going to work, and then they see something happening that isn't hostile, isn't self-righteous, isn't holier than thou, but is clearly some kind of a political engagement that they want to stop and give 30 seconds to, and then take a moment. And it's hard, but I refer to that as earning a moment. That's a term from theater. If you want to preach at people and get your point across of your great social play, you want to earn that moment by surprising them. It's hard to do in this culture because we've seen everything before, but it happens once in a while.
There's been a lot of talk lately about the 60s, the protest movements of the 60s in the context of the political climate today. When you look back at the protest movement in the 60s, how do you view those protests?
Yeah. Well, one thing, their media structure was a bit simpler. I'm not saying they had it easy or anything, but the media was a little bit less monopolized on the one hand. And there still was this social contract a little bit that news corporations had to provide news as a way of earning their right to use the public airwaves. They had that sort of social contract still happening. The news wasn't a profit center. So they were in a somewhat, I'm not saying it was fair or easy or anything, but I do think there were fewer channels, so there was less distraction for the public. And at the same time, it really was a different, not a great one, but a different environment. So I think they had the ability in that context to perhaps get a little more attention and to get to, because I see all the point of tactical performance is to be a force multiplier for your movement or a voice amplifier. And I think in the 60s also, because the culture overall was a bit more conservative, and a bit more easily shocked, you see what I mean? That you could then do some of these actions. So when the Yippies, I'm just going to pick an obvious, the Yippies, when they levitated the Pentagon, quote unquote, and did this whole action like that, or when they dropped dollar bills. They rained down a suitcase full of dollar bills on the Wall Street, the trading floor of New York Stock Exchange, and everyone went crazy and went grabbing the money. Those kinds of spectacular actions could really resonate in that environment, and at the same time, some of what that kind of movement was doing wasn't necessarily, they weren't only specifically to stop the war, but to create a counterculture. What may have gotten lost in the historical record a little bit is a lot of these folks in the late 60s who were so outrageous, the Chicago 8, et cetera, they were influenced by the much more staid and almost devout tone of the civil rights movement that had happened just earlier. Some of them had participated in that movement, right, and been beaten up in the South as part of voter registration drives, et cetera. And they were influenced by that, and then a few years later, they got very countercultural. Part of the logic underlying both of those movements, though, even though they looked very different, comparing the hippies and the yippies to, the Dr. King movement might seem strange, but they had this underlying idea of thinking in terms of sociodrama, creating confrontations in which you've already set the situation up so that when the authorities show up and repress your action, you've already set up a scene where they're the antagonists, they're the bad guys, because you've thought tactically in that way. So I think that the civil rights movement had a lot of influence on something as strange looking as the hippies, because some of them trained with that movement and learned, we actually have to think in terms of symbolism, in terms of rituals, and telling our story on the world stage with this new technology.
Which really raises the question of whether or not the goal of some of this protest is simply to shock and call attention to a particular issue, or whether it needs to have some kind of narrative arc as part of it, that it needs to tell a story in some way.
This is what, there's one of the binaries or the dichotomies in tactical performances. Like, is this a direct action where we're blocking the train, that's coming through? There's a train with nuclear waste coming through town. We're going to block the train. Now, we've physically done something that's a direct action, right? And indirect action is we're going to do something that changes people's minds, calls attention to the problem, gets the senator to change their vote. That's an indirect action. I do think that that's a false binary, though, right? I think that the sweet spot is the hybridity, is when an action both has some kind of direct impact on the issue, so that it's not just trying to get in the media as the only measure. That's not good to only be focused on pages again in the news, but that it does both things. You have a direct impact, but also try to make the movement more attractive for people to join, because what your action was interesting and seemed like a good thing to take part in. And then also that indirect action side of it, to tell your story, to fight the battle of the story. There's almost a narrative battle in terms of, well, for example, this is what this corporation is saying about, their activities. And we want to tell the story that they're actually polluting the environment. Well, it's not a direct battle. It's a battle in the world of narrative. Sometimes, though, you got to block the road in order to get the chance to tell your version of the story, you see. So the two functions kind of overlap in that sense.
Which raises the question about violence and the role of violence in these protests. We've seen some of it already in the political campaign this year. We may see more of it in Cleveland or Philadelphia. Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I'd like to make distinctions between violence, force, and pressure. I think we are facing a situation where, look, Trump doesn't only have experience in reality TV, but also with professional wrestling. He had played a part. So that's what I've been thinking of when I see him say, get him, and the people attack the protesters. I'm like, this is like very high stakes, late Roman Empire kind of action influenced by professional wrestling rhetoric. So yeah, I'm concerned about what's going to happen. Sometimes my friend David Solnit made this clear. I remember sometimes fighting the battle of the story just disintegrates into the story of the battle. where it's just about how many people got hurt, how many windows got broken, and then it just degenerates into a conversation about that, property damage or human damage. And that's unfortunate if your main goal was to tell the story, was to make your critique of, let's say, Trump, and to elevate what you want. It's not just about protesting what you're against, it's about telling people what you want, right? So I think that actions that focus on pressure as opposed to violence, you can find pressure points on the body politic, like good acupressure in the human body. You can find points on the body politic where say, let's put some creative pressure on this point. And even though we don't have a lot of resources and we don't have tons of people, if we make this symbolic intervention right here, I think this is a point where we can get a lot of movement towards what we want. And that's kind of easier for me to say than for people to do, but I think that's more the goal. It's a question of thinking, what are the images we are creating, and will it build a movement and make it bigger, or will it actually make the movement a bit more marginalized? So I don't want to condemn any particular tactic all the time. I think it depends on the situation. But for me, it's about that kind of creative acupressure on the body politic that I think is more likely to get the story out and build a bigger movement and being surprising. And if there's going to be suffering, I go back to the idea, the way that the civil rights movement theorized themselves. A lot of people have written about the civil rights movement. They had all the agency and the smarts, and they totally theorized their own work. And they talked about not just sociodrama, but creative suffering, which is like, look, if we're going to get hurt, let's be creative about it and get the most we can out of it, because we're suffering out here anyway. So if there's going to be a situation that's dangerous, let's have set it up ahead of time, like with the lunch counter sit-ins, where we've rehearsed it, we know exactly what we're doing. We understand there's going to be some violence from the other side because they've become quite predictable in their response to things. But let's set the situation up so that when these sit-ins get attacked, and then the police arrest the victims and not the perpetrators, for example, which is exactly how they set that up, it becomes this global spectacle of racist cruelty that tells our story and that actually puts pressure on authorities to change the situation. So I'm just giving that example. I see that as a super sophisticated and thoughtful way to go into a dangerous situation, really more prepared than your much more powerful and aggressive opponent, right? So that's the kind of thing that I think is a great example.
What's different, though, is the nature of the coverage today, the fact that it is wall-to-wall, the fact that it is 24/7, and it's almost as if the event, the action, the political theater, the performance has to somehow be designed very clearly with the coverage in mind.
There just recently, there's hunger strikers in San Francisco who did this great, very risky hunger strike against police brutality. And, a lot of people heard about it, but a lot of people didn't hear about it, And I think ideally that's the kind of action that would get a lot more attention. However people felt about it, positive or negative, it should be something, in my mind, that people should know is happening. So, it's almost like the media. I really don't want to say that the purpose of the thing is to get into the media, but I do think that's one of the goals, and to be conscious of the story you're telling. So, and what it looks like, what does winning look like? What is the goal that we're going for? And how can we, without only making the action about reaching the media, how can we use other forms of media too, and make our own media, right? And use the internet, use this free stuff, YouTube, Facebook, etc., social media to tell the story as well. And sometimes if something gets big enough on that level, then the media will, because it becomes a meme that spreads, that's another way to get into the bigger outlets. But I do want to talk about a little bit other forms of measurement. Like sometimes we'll do an action, right? Mm-hmm. And I would joke like, okay, how many widgets of social change did we create today? How effective was this? And it's very hard to measure, and if at all, right? So some of it would be, oh, we got a lot of media coverage. But okay, that's one thing. The other thing is like, well, how many people actually saw this happen in their immediate moment? They walked past us, they stopped, they talked to us. Even if those numbers aren't as big, it's a more profound engagement. And so I think that, and then they go and tell their friends at work what happened, or they make a little, I always like it when I see people taking a video of an action on their cell phones. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but they might show their friend later, look what happened. This is wild. So other forms of efficacy, too, are empowering the people who do the action. And, you might have somebody who's thinking about becoming part of the movement. They do a fun, creative action, and now it opens their mind up, and now they're going to be part of the movement for a long time. So, you know what I mean? It's like there's different measures of what the actions do, be it the oil enforcement agency or a sit-in, or street theater. Sometimes it makes the members of your group a tighter knit group, because now they have these stories, and we need they have these common experiences. So I think it's about building a movement, making it stronger, and reaching out to new people, be it through the media or however.
From that perspective, when you look back at something like Occupy Wall Street, was that a success or a failure?
I'm on the side of success. And that's the thing. And so it was a great question, because of course a lot of people, I've heard people say, it didn't do anything. And I think folks who don't think it did anything might have an unrealistic expectation in the first place. Like, Occupy did not collectivize, or Occupy didn't turn all the banks into cooperative credit unions in a few months. Citibank's not your local cooperative credit union. No, that didn't happen. It didn't totally overthrow and change the whole economic system. But that was never going to do that. It's the beginning of a movement. It had a great, these tense villages that sprung up all around the place, including in Davis here and in Berkeley and, a lot of towns, even throughout the Midwest, et cetera. Like, that was an amazing symbolic evocation of the Hoovervilles, right, from the last Depression, which came from too little regulation of the big banks, et cetera. So, I mean, it was this amazing, both had a direct impact on the landscape and had a symbolism to it. And I'm not the first person to say it, but it did change the conversation around class and the outrageous inequality going on and where that comes from. And it did suggest measures. Some folks said they didn't have enough of a specific platform. I think that it was pretty clear what they were about if you were willing to actually listen, and it wasn't dogmatic and sectarian, but it did make clear and create it changed the conversation in the country around these issues of inequality. So I think, and also, the energy doesn't just disappear. Like, when those tent cities around the country were dispersed, including, as you know, the pepper spray incident here in Davis was around the beginning of a student sort of occupied tent setup. So that's one of our infamous moments. Actually, was part of this wave, right? It's not like then that disappears and okay, the village, the little occupied tent villages are gone and it's all over. It takes other forms. People now have been radicalized. They've gained a lot from this sort of prefigurative experience of creating a little village. How do we keep things clean here? How do we share resources? How do we have collective sort of meetings where we learn how to really listen to each other, right? I mean, the Occupy villages were an exercise in minimizing hierarchy and talking about new ways of being. So that's a radicalizing, in a good way, experience for thousands of people who then don't disappear. They go on and do other things. And that's a lot about the history of these movements is, okay, right, that movement ended, but then most of those people went on and created this new movement. So there's examples of Occupy people preventing home foreclosures in their neighborhood and creating human blockades so that the bank can't evict people. And suddenly the bank renegotiates the mortgage because they don't need the aggravation. Like, that's happened here and there around the country. It's not as spectacular. Wolf Blitzer's not going to talk about that incident, on CNN. It's not, but I think it's a great example of participatory democracy continuing through other forms. So I think Occupy was a great success for if you have a realistic view of what it was about.
L.H. Bogad, I thank you so much for spending time with us today here on Radio Who, What, Why.
It's an honor, Jeff. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you'll join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share it and help other people find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.